The old taxi rolled to a stop in front of the hotel, its paint chipped and its frame trembling slightly from age, and the chief executive standing on the curb burst out laughing at the sight of it. He called it a heap of scrap metal that was ruining the image of his city, loud enough for the cameras nearby to catch every word of his contempt. He ordered the security guards to push the driver away from the pickup zone, never once suspecting that the quiet man behind the wheel had once protected the most important convoys in the entire country. Nolan Reed said nothing in return. He only bent down to pick up an old badge that had slipped from his jacket pocket and rolled across the pavement. At that exact moment, a long line of black vehicles slowed at the entrance, brakes hissing in unison, and a door swung open before anyone could react. The President of the United States stepped out, walked past the stunned executive without a glance, and went straight toward the man who had just been humiliated in front of everyone. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the handshake that is about to happen is only the beginning of a downfall that will shake an entire empire to its foundation. The morning over Bellwether was pale and quiet, and Nolan Reed moved around his old taxi with the same careful attention he gave every single day before starting his shift, checking the tires, the mirrors, and the brake fluid with hands that had done this work for 20 years without ever needing to be told twice. The car carried scratches along its doors and a small dent near the rear panel, yet beneath the tired paint the engine ran smoothly, and the braking system had been maintained with a precision that most mechanics never bothered to apply to a vehicle this old, because to Nolan the car was never about appearances but about the lives it carried inside it. And that morning those lives included a passenger named Dr. Maren Holt, who needed a ride to the Grand Halcyon Hotel, where the National Transportation Future Conference was about to open its doors to the world. Maren recognized him the moment she slid into the back seat, though she said nothing about the years that had passed or the career he had once held, choosing instead to ask him plainly why a man with his level of expertise was still driving a taxi through the streets of a city that barely noticed him. And Nolan answered simply that a car did not need to be beautiful in order to bring a person home safely, a sentence that settled into the quiet of the cab like something he had said to himself many times before. As they approached the hotel, the avenue had transformed into a corridor of polished limousines, gleaming electric prototypes, and reporters jostling for position beneath rows of television lights. Every inch of pavement claimed by machines built to impress rather than to endure, and the contrast between that spectacle and the worn blue taxi idling at its edge was impossible to miss. Hotel staff glanced at the old car with visible irritation, waving toward a side lane reserved for service vehicles. But Nolan calmly explained that his passenger was one of the conference's invited speakers, only to be told to wait regardless while sleeker cars were ushered through without a second look. He did not argue further, accustomed by now to the particular kind of dismissal reserved for anyone arriving in a vehicle that failed to match the polish of the surrounding event. And he simply guided the taxi toward the designated lane while Maren watched from the back seat with quiet disapproval at how easily people decided someone's worth based on nothing more than the paint covering their car. Inside the crowd of cameras and assistants, Sterling Ashcroft IV strode forward with the practiced confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own importance, preparing to unveil his company's newest creation, a self-driving vehicle named Apex One, to an audience that had already decided to be impressed before the unveiling even began. It was in that moment, glancing past the rehearsed staging of his own product reveal, that Sterling's eyes landed on the scratched blue taxi parked just behind his gleaming backdrop, and his expression shifted from practiced charm into something colder within the span of a single breath. The cameras had already begun panning across the row of polished vehicles assembled for his unveiling, and the presence of one dented, ordinary car sitting so close to that carefully arranged display felt to him like a stain on something he had spent months perfecting, a small detail that threatened to undercut the image of flawless progress he intended to sell to the entire nation that morning. Sterling crossed the distance between himself and the taxi with quick, irritated steps, certain that the presence of such a vehicle so close to his live broadcast was nothing short of an insult to everything his brand stood for. He bent down, rapped his knuckles against the dented hood as though testing whether the metal itself might collapse under his touch, and asked Nolan, loud enough for the surrounding reporters to hear, whether a car like this could possibly survive a real safety inspection, the question delivered with the kind of smirk that expected laughter rather than an answer. A small cluster of assistants standing nearby began laughing before Nolan had even finished answering, eager to align themselves with whatever opinion their employer offered first. And one junior reporter lowered his camera slightly, sensing that something about the exchange felt crueler than the light-hearted moment. Sterling clearly intended it to be for the cameras still rolling behind him. Nolan replied evenly that the taxi had just passed inspection and that its braking system outperformed several of the newer models currently on display, a statement so calm that it seemed to catch Sterling off guard for a brief second before he recovered with an even louder laugh, telling the gathered crowd that this was simply the comforting delusion of a driver who could never afford anything better. Assistants and a handful of reporters chuckled along, eager to stay on the good side of a man who controlled advertising budgets larger than most television networks, and Sterling pressed further, declaring that vehicles exactly like this one were the very reason the country needed to hand its entire transportation system over to companies like his. He turned to the hotel manager and ordered the taxi removed from the premises entirely, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to having every inconvenience disappear the moment he raised his voice. And for a moment it seemed as though Nolan would simply be pushed aside without another word. Then Marin stepped out from the back seat, calmly stating that Nolan was her personal driver for the conference, a fact that visibly unsettled Sterling for the briefest instant before he masked it behind a remark about maintaining proper standards for such an important event. As the staff prepared to tow the old taxi away, Nolan's attention drifted toward the Apex One parked nearby, where a faint, irregular whine was coming from somewhere near its front wheel assembly, a sound most people in that crowd would never have noticed, but one that immediately set off every instinct Nolan had spent decades sharpening. He studied the sensor housing, the diagnostic display flickering on a nearby technician's tablet, and the subtle hesitation in the brake response during a routine systems check, then quietly told Sterling that the vehicle should not be driven in its current configuration. Sterling rounded on him with open scorn, demanding to know what qualifications a taxi driver could possibly hold to critique a machine worth hundreds of millions of dollars in research and engineering, his voice rising just enough that nearby cameras began drifting toward the unexpected confrontation. Nolan did not raise his own voice in return. He simply pointed toward the Apex One and said that if it ran in its current state, it would fail to stop exactly when stopping mattered most, a sentence delivered with such quiet certainty that even some of the engineers standing near the display exchanged uneasy glances with one another, glances that lingered far longer than Sterling seemed to notice as he turned back toward the cameras to continue his presentation. Sterling, sensing an opportunity to embarrass the stranger publicly rather than simply dismiss him, demanded that Nolan explain himself in front of the assembled engineering team, certain that whatever followed would only make him look foolish. Nolan calmly described how the wheel speed sensors were transmitting signals out of sync with the central control unit, and how a redundancy layer appeared to have been deliberately disabled to make the vehicle accelerate more smoothly during demonstration runs. Details so specific that one young engineer near the back, Tessa Monroe, stiffened almost imperceptibly because she recognized every word of what Nolan was describing as something she herself had warned about for weeks. She glanced quickly toward Sterling, then back toward the stranger in the worn jacket who had just described, in under a minute, the exact failure she had spent 3 separate reports trying to explain to people who refused to listen. And for the first time in months, she felt something close to relief mixed with a sharp, uncomfortable fear of what might happen next. Sterling cut him off before anyone else could react, insisting that Nolan was simply repeating technical buzzwords picked up from some online forum, then mocked the old taxi once more, asking aloud why a supposed mechanical genius was still earning his living off a meter mounted on a dashboard rather than off real engineering work. Nolan revealed nothing about his past in response, choosing instead to simply ask that the system be checked thoroughly before anyone climbed into the vehicle again, a request so reasonable that it only seemed to irritate Sterling further. Determined to turn the moment into entertainment for the cameras, Sterling proposed a public challenge, suggesting that if Nolan truly believed his battered old taxi was safer than a flagship product representing years of innovation, he should bring it up onto the display platform so the reporters could enjoy a proper laugh at his expense. Nolan declined without hesitation, refusing to participate in what was clearly designed to be a performance rather than a genuine test of anything, which only gave Sterling another opening to address the cameras directly, framing Nolan as a perfect example of people too frightened of progress to accept the future arriving around them. Grant Holloway, the hotel manager eager to please his most prestigious client, confiscated Nolan's temporary access pass and ordered him behind a rope line, separating staff and drivers from the main entrance, treating the entire exchange as settled business. As Nolan bent down to gather a notebook that had fallen from his bag during the commotion, an old technical badge slipped from his jacket pocket and skittered across the pavement, catching the eye of an older security guard who recognized the design but said nothing before being called away to another post. In the distance, the low wail of a motorcade siren rose over the noise of the crowd, signaling that a presidential convoy was approaching the now heavily secured perimeter surrounding the hotel. Sterling straightened his jacket and smiled with unmistakable satisfaction, fully convinced that the convoy's arrival was meant to witness the unveiling of his greatest achievement, rather than anything connected to the man he had just spent the last several minutes humiliating in front of an audience of strangers. He turned briefly toward his assistants and instructed them to make sure the cameras captured his greeting with the arriving officials from the best possible angle, already imagining the headlines that would follow once the president arrived to praise the future of transportation standing right there on the platform behind him. Never once, considering that the man he had just shoved behind a rope line might be the reason the convoy had slowed at all. The motorcade eased through the security checkpoint with practiced precision, forcing the assembled crowd back several steps as black vehicles rolled past in tight formation toward the hotel's main entrance. And Sterling adjusted his tie one final time before stepping into position to deliver the welcome speech he had rehearsed countless times that week. Photographers jostled for the best angle, certain that whatever happened next would dominate every front page across the country by evening, and none of them noticed the brief flicker of recognition crossing the president's face as his car slowed near the rope line where an ordinary taxi driver stood quietly among the crowd. Nolan remained behind the rope line beside his battered taxi, still treated as nothing more than an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than acknowledged, his expression unreadable as the limousine carrying the President of the United States rolled slowly past the barricade separating the public from the arriving dignitaries. Through the tinted glass, Elias Waverley caught sight of a familiar face among the ordinary crowd, and without explanation he ordered the entire convoy to come to a halt inside the hotel's secured perimeter, an instruction so unexpected that even his own security detail hesitated for a brief moment before complying. The rear door of the limousine opened, and rather than walking towards Sterling, who stood waiting with an outstretched hand and a rehearsed smile, the president crossed directly to the rope line where Nolan stood quietly beside his old taxi. Elias greeted him by name, gripping his hand firmly, and asked aloud why the man who had designed the very safety protocol now protecting convoys across the entire federal government was standing behind a barricade like an outsider. The surrounding crowd fell completely silent, and those who only minutes earlier had been laughing at Nolan's expense now stood frozen, uncertain how to process what they were witnessing unfold in front of them. Sterling attempted to insert himself into the conversation, introducing himself quickly and explaining that Nolan was merely the driver for one of the conference attendees, a claim the president addressed without hesitation by revealing that Nolan Reed had once saved his life when a brake failure struck his own motorcade along a mountain pass years earlier. He went further, explaining that improvements Nolan introduced afterward had prevented several similar incidents since, despite Nolan repeatedly refusing any public recognition for the work he had done. Elias glanced toward the old blue taxi parked just beyond the rope line, recognizing it immediately as the very vehicle Nolan had restored himself years before, and remarked that he would trust riding inside that car far more than inside anything that had not yet passed beneath Nolan's careful inspection. Marin, standing nearby, seized the opening to mention that Nolan had just warned everyone present about a critical flaw in the Apex One, a statement that instantly drained every trace of confidence from Sterling's expression. The president turned toward Sterling directly, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, and asked him plainly whether he had verified Nolan Reed's warning yet. A question that left Sterling searching for words in front of every camera now pointed squarely at him, the silence stretching long enough that even his own assistants began shifting uncomfortably at the edges of the crowd. Sterling recovered quickly, thanking Nolan with exaggerated warmth and announcing to every reporter within earshot that his company would review the vehicle out of an abundance of caution, transforming the entire incident into a carefully staged moment of cooperation between tradition and innovation before the cameras could capture anything resembling genuine embarrassment. The instant the president disappeared into the hotel, however, Sterling's demeanor shifted completely, and he immediately instructed his communications team to release a statement describing Nolan as nothing more than an old acquaintance of the president rather than any sort of credentialed expert whose opinion deserved attention. He pressured Grant Holloway to erase the security footage capturing his earlier insults toward Nolan, and he directed Blaine Caldwell, his legal counsel, to quietly investigate Nolan's finances and personal history in search of any leverage that might neutralize the threat he now represented. Blaine returned within hours with details about tuition payments Nolan was making for his daughter Leela and a modest loan he carried for repairs to a small garage he had been slowly restoring on the edge of town, information Sterling intended to use as a pressure point rather than as evidence of an honest man simply trying to provide for his family. Sterling personally offered to purchase the old taxi for an amount well beyond its actual worth, attaching a condition that Nolan sign an agreement never to publicly speak about the Apex One again, an offer Nolan refused without a moment's hesitation, telling him plainly that safety was not something that could be purchased with a single check, and that silence bought with money still carried the same weight as a lie, no matter how many zeros were attached to it. When the bribe failed, Sterling shifted immediately into threats, warning that legal action for damaging his company's reputation could follow if Nolan continued speaking publicly about anything he had observed. He reminded Nolan, in a tone meant to sound helpful rather than menacing, that lawsuits filed by corporations with unlimited resources had a way of dragging on for years, draining the savings of ordinary people long before any court reached a final verdict, and that a man with a daughter in college could ill afford that kind of fight. Nolan listened to every word without flinching, then replied that he had already lost more in his life than any lawsuit could ever take from him, and that fear of losing money had never once been strong enough to make him stay silent about something that could get a stranger killed. Later that evening, Tessa approached Nolan quietly in the hotel parking structure, admitting that the flaw he had identified had already appeared during 3 separate internal tests, one of which had come dangerously close to causing a serious accident, before Sterling personally ordered the test reports altered to protect the scheduled public launch. She explained that a non-disclosure agreement bound her tightly and that speaking openly could end her entire career in an industry that rarely forgave engineers who challenged powerful executives. Nolan told her gently that he did not need her trust, only her decision about whether she intended to stand beside the truth or remain hidden behind a signature she had been pressured into giving. Nolan listened without interrupting, understanding better than most the weight a person carried when forced to choose between protecting a career and protecting strangers who would never know her name. And he told her that the people riding inside those vehicles deserved someone willing to stand between them and the people who designed the machines without ever planning to ride in them themselves. He reminded her gently that courage rarely arrived all at once, that it usually showed up first as a single quiet decision made in an empty parking structure long before anyone else noticed, and that the easiest mistake any engineer could make was waiting for permission to do the right thing. Before walking away into the darkened parking structure, Tessa revealed one final detail that struck Nolan with far more weight than anything she had said before, confirming that the Apex One scheduled for the next day's public demonstration had been deliberately locked out of its safety override mode through a direct command issued from Sterling's own private account. Marin invited Nolan the following morning to join an informal technical review inside a restricted engineering bay set up for the conference, an invitation he accepted only after a long pause. Uncertain whether he wanted to step back into a world of power and recognition he had deliberately walked away from years before. A brief phone call from Lila that morning reminded him why he had made that choice in the first place, her voice warm and a little nervous as she asked about his week, unaware of just how much her father had sacrificed to give her an ordinary, steady childhood rather than one shaped by prestige. Nolan thought back to the months after his wife Claire had been diagnosed with an illness that worsened faster than any of the doctors expected, and how he had turned down a senior position that would have demanded constant travel in order to stay close enough to drive her to every appointment himself. After Claire passed away, he continued driving the very same taxi not out of necessity, but because it was the last vehicle the 3 of them had ridden together in as a complete family, a fact he had never explained to anyone who mocked the worn paint covering its doors. He remembered small things most people would have forgotten by now, the particular way Claire used to rest her hand against the window during long drives, the sound Lila made as a child whenever the engine idled too long at a red light, and the quiet certainty he felt every time he climbed behind the wheel that he was still keeping a promise made long before either of them had any reason to need one. He had been offered new cars more than once over the years, each time politely declining, because to him the value of that vehicle had nothing to do with its market price, and everything to do with what it had carried through the hardest season of his life. Inside the engineering bay, Nolan worked through diagnostic logs with the same methodical patience that had defined his entire career, quickly realizing that what he had spotted the previous day was no simple oversight, but a deliberate engineering decision made under pressure from above. The vehicle's braking architecture had originally been designed with 3-layered safety systems, yet 2 of those layers had been intentionally disabled to make the car respond faster and look more impressive during public demonstrations, while internal reports had been quietly rewritten to hide any sign of brake failure occurring under conditions of sensor interference. Nolan explained calmly to Marin that the technology itself was not the danger. The arrogance of the executive overseeing it was the real threat sitting inside every vehicle bearing his company's name, a distinction that made the days ahead far more dangerous than either of them had first anticipated. Marin immediately moved to convene an emergency review before the scheduled public test run could proceed, but Sterling used every ounce of his influence to insist the event continue as planned, claiming that any cancellation would cost billions of dollars in investor confidence overnight. He called in favors from members of the conference organizing committee, reminding several of them privately about contracts and donations his family had provided over the years, pressure that quietly shifted at least 2 votes in his favor before the review committee had even finished gathering its evidence. Marin recognized exactly what was happening but refused to back down, insisting that no amount of financial pressure could be allowed to outweigh the safety of everyone scheduled to stand near that vehicle the following day. Vivian Blackstone, chair of the company's board, sided with Sterling at first, more concerned with protecting the stock price than with questioning a man whose family name had built much of the company's reputation over decades. Just as the review team prepared to access the original testing servers for confirmation, Nolan discovered that the most critical set of data had been deleted only minutes earlier, erased so quickly that whoever ordered it clearly understood exactly what was at stake. Sterling called an unscheduled press conference that same afternoon, framing the entire controversy as the work of an opportunistic taxi driver attempting to exploit a chance encounter with the president for personal attention and financial gain. He released selective portions of Nolan's professional history, emphasizing how many years had passed since he had formally worked in the field, hoping to plant doubt about whether his expertise still held any relevance in a rapidly advancing industry. News outlets began debating openly whether Nolan deserved to be taken seriously at all, unable to ignore the handshake everyone had witnessed, but unwilling to dismiss Sterling's carefully worded framing either. Panels of commentators spent entire segments dissecting whether a man could remain a credible expert after stepping away from an industry for so many years, while others pointed out that the president himself had vouched for Nolan's record without hesitation, and the resulting confusion left much of the public undecided about who actually deserved their trust in the matter. Unable to deny what the cameras had captured, Sterling shifted his strategy, publicly praising Nolan's past contributions while quietly insisting his current judgment could no longer be trusted. Blaine Caldwell delivered one final settlement offer to Nolan that evening, including a significant sum of money, a fully renovated garage, and complete tuition coverage for Lila in exchange for his silence, an offer Nolan tore in half without raising his voice or making a single threat in return. Blaine seemed almost confused by the rejection, explaining slowly as though Nolan might not have understood the size of the number written on the page, but Nolan only shook his head and told him that some things simply were not for sale, no matter how generous the price appeared to be on paper. He added that he had already built a life out of less than what most people considered comfortable, and that trading his daughter's respect for a number on a check was a debt he had no intention of ever repaying. Sterling insulted him once more during a brief private exchange, suggesting that a good father would understand the value of accepting money rather than clinging stubbornly to his own pride. A remark Nolan answered by saying that a good father teaches his child that staying silent about danger is itself a form of lying. Tessa disappeared from the conference grounds shortly afterward, leaving both Nolan and Marin uncertain whether she had lost her nerve entirely and decided to protect her own career instead of speaking the truth. Vivian announced publicly that the demonstration would proceed exactly as scheduled, insisting that without a complete and verified data trail, the company had no legal obligation to delay anything. Returning to his taxi that night, Nolan pulled up the dashboard camera footage from the previous morning's drive. Recalling that Bluebird had traveled briefly alongside a prototype Apex 1, undergoing road testing on the same stretch of highway. The footage clearly showed the prototype's braking response lagging at a critical moment, accompanied by a faint audible warning tone from its control system, and the timestamp could be cross-referenced against the official testing logs that had since been quietly altered. Just as Nolan finished isolating the relevant clip, Tessa reappeared at his car window, holding a small storage device containing a complete, unaltered copy of the original testing records. The files revealed something far worse than anyone had suspected, showing that Sterling had not merely been aware of the flaw in the system, but had personally issued the order to disable the final remaining safety layer himself. By morning, hundreds of investors, government officials, and journalists had gathered along the sealed testing track for the conference's most anticipated event, eager to witness the official public demonstration of the Apex 1 in motion. Sterling insisted on riding inside the vehicle himself, determined to project total confidence in front of every camera trained on the track, though privately he had instructed technicians to program a simplified route designed to avoid the exact conditions that had previously triggered the system's failure. Nolan understood that Sterling believed he had eliminated every variable that mattered, yet he also knew the electromagnetic interference generated by the surrounding broadcast equipment alone could still be enough to trigger the same flaw under the right circumstances. Marin formally requested a delay, but Sterling dismissed the request in front of the crowd, accusing his critics of deliberate sabotage meant to damage his company's reputation on the very day it mattered most. Vivian warned Nolan quietly that if his predictions proved wrong, the financial and legal consequences for misleading the company publicly would fall entirely on him. Nolan made no attempt to defend his reputation in response, offering instead 3 precise technical predictions describing exactly when and how the failure would likely occur during the test run. The demonstration began smoothly, and the first 2 laps passed without any sign of trouble, drawing visible smirks from several onlookers who had grown convinced that Nolan's warnings had simply been wrong from the start. Reporters near the finish line began drafting headlines that painted the entire controversy as nothing more than a misunderstanding fueled by an outdated mechanic's wounded pride, and a few of Sterling's closest allies started applauding before the final lap had even finished, certain the moment of doubt had already passed them by completely. Sterling glanced toward him repeatedly from inside the moving vehicle, his expression carrying unmistakable satisfaction as the crowd's doubt began shifting visibly in his favor. During the 3rd lap, exactly as Nolan had predicted, the sensor data began drifting out of alignment precisely the way it had during the earlier private tests Tessa had described. Nolan immediately instructed the control team to trigger an emergency stop before the vehicle entered the upcoming curve at full speed, but Sterling, unwilling to appear weak in front of the cameras, ordered the run to continue regardless of the warning. For a few unbearable seconds, the crowd watched the vehicle accelerate toward the curve while two contradictory commands competed for control of the same system, one from the man who built it and one from the man who had spent decades learning exactly how machines like it could fail. And in that brief stretch of silence, Tessa made the decision that would define the rest of her career. Tessa stepped forward without hesitation, asserting her technical authority over the vehicle's systems and activating an independent mechanical override that had not yet been stripped from the design, bringing the Apex One safely to a halt without injury to anyone inside or nearby. As the vehicle stopped, the central display screen overhead began projecting two conflicting datasets side by side, exposing the difference between what had actually occurred during testing and what the company's official records had claimed all along. A digital approval signature authorizing the deletion of every prior safety warning appeared clearly on the massive screen above the crowd, displaying a single unmistakable name, Sterling Ashcroft IV. A heavy silence fell over the entire testing ground as the authenticated data continued to project above the crowd, leaving no room for doubt about what everyone had just witnessed unfold in real time. Marin announced immediately that certification for the Apex One would be suspended indefinitely, and that the Federal Review Board was freezing all further progress on the company's pending $3.2 billion government contract. Vivian Blackstone called an emergency board session on the spot, her expression betraying none of the loyalty she had shown Sterling only a day earlier. Sterling attempted to shift blame toward Tessa, but the recovered engineering logs clearly documented every warning she had submitted over the preceding months. Each one met with pressure from his own office to alter the findings before they reached anyone outside the company. He continued insisting publicly that Nolan had somehow orchestrated the entire failure out of personal resentment over the earlier confrontation at the hotel, a claim that grew weaker with every passing minute. Nolan displayed the dashboard footage from his own taxi, demonstrating clearly that the braking flaw had existed long before any confrontation had ever taken place between the two of them. Turning the very vehicle Sterling had once mocked as worthless scrap metal into an independent piece of evidence no lawyer in the room could dismiss. Several reporters who had laughed along with Sterling only 2 days earlier now stood quietly reviewing the footage on their own devices, their earlier mockery replaced by the slow, uncomfortable realization that the man they had dismissed as irrelevant had been the only person in the entire building paying attention the whole time. President Waverly chose not to intervene directly in the unfolding investigation, emphasizing instead that due process and verified evidence, not personal relationships, needed to guide whatever decisions followed. He did, however, publicly thank Nolan for placing the safety of ordinary citizens above any personal advantage he might have gained from the moment, a statement that traveled quickly across every screen covering the conference. The board voted within the hour to suspend Sterling from his position as chief executive pending the outcome of a formal investigation into the falsified testing records. Several board members who had stood beside him at countless prior events now avoided his eyes entirely as the vote was read aloud, and Vivian, who had defended him only a day before, was the one who ultimately moved to formalize the suspension, stating plainly that loyalty to a name could never outweigh responsibility to the people who trusted the company's products with their lives. Grant Holloway, visibly shaken, handed over a partially preserved copy of the original security footage he had been ordered to destroy, footage that clearly documented Sterling's earlier insults toward Nolan along with the pressure he had applied afterward. Sterling left the conference grounds through a service entrance reserved for staff, no longer surrounded by assistants or cameras eager for his attention, the silence around him a stark contrast to the spectacle he had commanded only a day before. As he passed the old blue taxi parked near the exit, Sterling caught a brief glimpse of his own reflection in the scratched and faded paint, and Vivian, standing nearby, turned to offer Nolan a position of real influence within the company, an offer whose answer surprised everyone listening. For a long moment, Sterling simply stood there, staring at the worn metal he had once called an embarrassment to the city, unable to find a single word to say to the man standing beside it, and he walked the rest of the way to his car without looking back even once. Vivian formally proposed that Nolan accept the role of Chief Safety Officer at Ashcroft Mobility, accompanied by a substantial salary and a level of authority few outsiders were ever offered, but Nolan declined the position itself, explaining that he had no interest in becoming a symbol used to repair a damaged corporate image. He agreed instead to serve as an independent advisor, on the firm condition that the company commit publicly to protecting anyone who raised safety concerns and to releasing every future safety report without alteration or delay. Tessa was placed in charge of a newly formed engineering review team operating under independent oversight, finally given the authority to act on warnings rather than bury them to protect a launch date. Grant Holloway approached Nolan privately to apologize, admitting that he had chosen to serve power rather than treat another human being with basic decency, an apology Nolan accepted quietly without using the moment to humiliate him in return, simply noting that respect mattered most when it was given to someone who had nothing to offer in exchange. President Waverly extended an invitation for Nolan to attend a formal recognition ceremony, but Nolan asked instead for something small and private, free of cameras or public spectacle of any kind. A new transportation safety fund was established shortly afterward, dedicated to training mechanics and drivers from communities that rarely had access to opportunities inside the industry, funded in part by Nolan's own first advisory payment, which he used to open a small repair shop he named Bluebird Safety Works. The shop grew slowly over the following months, filling with young apprentices eager to learn from a man whose name had briefly appeared on every news broadcast in the country, though Nolan rarely spoke about any of it unless one of them asked directly, preferring instead to teach the same quiet lessons about patience and attention to detail that had carried him through every difficult chapter of his own life. Lila visited her father not long after everything had settled, and noticed a framed photograph of him shaking hands with the president tucked inside a drawer rather than displayed anywhere on the wall, a detail that told her everything she needed to know about how little he cared for recognition. Nolan continued driving the taxi several shifts each week regardless of his new responsibilities, unwilling to let go of the ordinary rhythm of life that had carried him through the hardest years of his past. In the final quiet morning of the story, he pulled Bluebird up to the entrance of the Grand Halcyon once more, and a new young attendant rushed forward to open his door, addressing him formally as Mr. Reed before he had even stepped out of the car. Nolan smiled and gently asked the young man to simply call him Nolan, nothing more and nothing less, before pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the steady flow of morning traffic. The scratched paint along the doors remained exactly as it had always been, yet not a single person watching him drive away that morning would have dared to judge the man behind the wheel by the surface of the car carrying him forward. Years of quiet work had taught him that the loudest voices in any room rarely belonged to the people worth trusting, and that the truest measure of a person's worth was never found in the polish of what they owned, but in what they were willing to protect when no one else was watching. The taxi rolled down the avenue exactly as it had 1,000 mornings before, ordinary to anyone who did not know its history, and entirely unforgettable to anyone who finally did.